القناة الصوتية باللغة العربية. راح يكون في ترجمة مباشرة للقاء من الإنجليزي للعربي. راح يكون لقائنا اليوم باللغة الإنجليزية مع ضيوفنا الكريمين. Thanks for making the time and for being here with us today. We're sure that we're going to have an interesting discussion with our valuable guest. First, I'd like to give an overview of this event. The event is planned for 2 hours, where we'll have 3 rounds of discussion with our guest for 1.5 for 1 hour and a half. And then we'll have 30-minute Q&A session to answer attendees' question. So please write down your questions in the chat session as the discussion progresses. The event today discusses the future of Syria's detainees. I think I need to be slow for translation. The event discusses the future of Syria's detainees, forcibly disappeared persons, and torture victims and survivors as the conflict enters its 11th year or 12th year. While it's hard to obtain accurate data on the number of victims of Assad's regime practices, the estimates vary from 225,000 to over 550,000 victims. The UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, or CR, stopped counting victims in 2014 at 350,000 victims. The forcibly disappeared are estimated to be at least 150,000. According to the Commission of Inquiry, the regime uses over 20 different torture methods, especially in general security and military intelligence branches, and routinely executes prisoners, especially in Sinai. This event is organized by Bahar and the Syrian Emergency Task Force. I'm starting off with a quick introduction of the hosting organizations. Bahar was established in 2012 by a group of medical professionals responding to the ever-increasing unmet needs in the conflict-affected Syrians. Since its official establishment in 2014 in Gaziantep, Turkey, Bahar has grown rapidly. In 2020-2021, the number of people reached has grown up to 1.5 million beneficiaries. Staffing increased to more than 1,000 in Syria alone, and the value of programming in the past 2 years rose up to $35 million. Bahar programming now stretches across the large Syrian territory of northern Syria, providing assistance in all humanitarian sectors, in addition to social cohesion, community peace building, and promotion of human rights. The Syrian Emergency Task Force is a US-based nonprofit organization. It was established in April 2011. SETF aims to bring an end to atrocities against Syrian civilians through advocacy, humanitarian initiatives, and pursuit of justice and accountability for war crimes. In all its efforts, it works closely with civilians on the ground in Syria and with key witnesses such as Caesar and the Gravedigger. I'd like to also briefly start with a brief introduction of our valuable guests. We have Omar Shori, who is a Syrian public speaker, detention survivor, and also we have we'll have a further expanded introduction when we start with each of our respective guests. We have also Maryam Kamal Maz, who is a daughter of humanitarian psychotherapist Maryam Kamal Maz, who has been unjustly detained in Syria since February of 2017. We also have Juma Al-Qasim. Mr. Juma is a Syrian humanitarian worker working with Bahar, whose father was killed in detention during the Syrian revolution, and 3 brothers were detained. We also have Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who served as US Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice from 2009 to 2015. Lastly, we have Muaz Mustafa. Mr. Muaz is the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Muaz was born and raised in Damascus, Syria, before he moved to US as a teenager. He's a former staffer of Congressman Vic Sender and Senator Blanche Lincoln. Mr. Mustafa spent several years working with the Capitol Hill. He joined SETF as executive director in the fall of 2011 to help advocate on behalf of pro-democracy movement in his native Syria. Mr. Mustafa also works closely with US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the defector Caesar, and the Gravedigger, who's a witness to mass graves in Syria since 2000, from 2011 to 2017 to bring awareness to the atrocities taking place in Syria. We'll start this event with Maz, who will be reading a message from the gravedigger to you, to all Syrians. Welcome, Mr. Maz. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for the kind introduction. And thank you to Bahar for organizing this important event. And I want to thank everyone who's attending. As Mohammed said, I'll be reading a letter that was written by the gravedigger specifically for this event. And I'll start now.
Please.
Recently, a clip surfaced of Assad regime officials rounding up and detaining civilians, executing them in cold blood, throwing them in trenches, and burning their bodies. It shocked the world, but to some of us, it was not surprising. We have seen again and again irrefutable evidence of the ongoing genocidal massacres against the Syrian people. I'm writing this letter to tell you my story. I have been witness to mass graves in Syria from 2011 until 2018, where men and women, children and elderly were tortured, executed, gassed, bombed by the Assad regime, Iran and Russia, and then callously thrown into trenches, their fate unknown to loved ones. Their lives have been lost, they cannot be saved, and they demand accountability. But the reason I'm sharing my story today is to tell you that they are digging more mass graves right now to bury more bodies, more victims of Assad, Russia, and Iran. I'm a civilian, and before the war, I was an administrative employee of the Damascus municipality. My job was to help families make final preparations for their loved ones' passing. Each funeral was dignified with religious prayers and rituals, and all were properly laid to rest. Family members were given the opportunity to say goodbye, and the sanctity of every grave was respected. In 2011, my office was visited by the regime intelligence officials, and I was ordered to work for them. And when the regime asks for something, you don't say no. I was not prepared for the horror of my duties. Every week, twice a week, 3 trailer trucks arrived packed with hundreds of bodies of victims of torture, bombardment, and slaughter. Twice a week, 3 to 4 pickup trucks with 30 to 40 bodies of civilians that had been executed in Saydnaya prison arrived for disposal in the most inhumane way. After 7 years of bearing witness to these atrocities, thanks to God and the ineptitude of the regime, I was able to escape Syria and follow my family to Europe. There, it was not only my duty, but my honor to testify before the German National Court in Koblenz and seek some semblance of justice to hold war criminals accountable for the ongoing atrocities in Syria. I have never been able to forget what I saw, the countless bodies I buried. It keeps me up at night, and I will never sleep soundly carrying this burden. No one should, because these massacres are still happening. There are, according to conservative estimates, at least 150,000 missing and accounted for Syrians. Their families have no closure, holding out hope for any bit of information. My heart is heavy with the knowledge that many are at this very moment experiencing inhumane torture at the hands of the Assad regime. And some I know exactly where they are piled into mass graves that are still being dug today. Russia, by its own admission, tested over 200 weapons on civilians in Syria. The international community looked the other way, and now Russia is using those same weapons and tactics in Ukraine. It is these same weapons and tactics that it honed in its 7 years waging war against the Syrian people. Where is the line? Chemical weapons against innocent civilians was not the line in Syria. The playbook of these tyrants is written, and I fear the worst for the Ukrainian people. We must finally learn from the past and not let this never again moment happen yet again. When the international community fails to condemn crimes against humanity, genocidal massacres, the bombardment of hospitals and schools, enforced disappearances and detention, criminal regimes will continue to push the limits unhindered. Worse still are countries like Denmark that a blind eye to what is unfolding in Syria and deem it safe for the return of refugees terrorized by a regime that killed, disappeared, and tortured their friends, family members, and members of their community. These mass graves I witnessed were in Damascus and its surrounding area. These areas are not safe. Syria is not safe for refugees as long as the Assad regime remains in power. I want to leave you with just one of the stories that keeps me up at night. One day, one of the trailer trucks dumped its contents of several hundred dead, mangled corpses into the trench in front of us. Unexpectedly, we saw a flicker of movement. There was a man near death, desperately using his last reserve of energy to signal to us that somehow he was still alive. One of the civilian workers crying said that we had to do something. The intelligence officer supervising us ordered the bulldozer driver to run over him. The driver could not hesitate, or else he would have been next. He ran over the man in the trenches, killing him. And as for the young man who had dared to shed tears over the victims of Assad's regime, we never saw him again. I write this letter to appeal to you as human beings. Take heed of what is happening in Syria. Although hundreds of thousands have already been murdered and disappeared, and millions displaced, the worst is still yet to come. It can be prevented, but I beg of you, do not wait a second longer. Take action.
Thank you very much, Maz. Thanks for communicating this touching message from the gravedigger. We'll be back to you in our next round of discussion. Okay, so we'll be moving forward to Omar Ashuri. I'll just do a quick introduction of the well-known Omar. Omar is, as I mentioned earlier, he's a Syrian public speaker, detention survivor, and a Georgetown University student who is currently based in Washington, D.C. Omar fled Syria at the age of 20 after being arrested and imprisoned for participation in rallies and demonstration against the Syrian regime with the help of his mother. Omar was finally smuggled from the prison at the age of 20. Omar leads the Syrian Emergency Task Force's efforts to advocate for the liberation of detainees as Director of Detainees Affairs. He's also a key witness to many prosecution efforts to hold the Assad regime accountable for the war crimes, and he also plays an important role alongside Caesar as a key witness for future US national prosecution efforts of the Assad regime, where American citizens have been executed and others remain detained by the regime. Very welcome, Omar. I'd like to start with asking you to reflect on your detention experience, including numbering the bodies that ended up in the Caesar photos. How do you relate to what the gravedigger described or in his letter?
Thank you for having me. Holding the Syrian regime accountable for their crimes, we're depending so much on people who've been working with the regime itself, like the gravedigger and Caesar. We rely on people who went through these experiences and can tell their story, the story of what happened in these prisons, what happened in this war, where 100,000 people died. In one of the prisons where I spent 1 year, 9 months, French 215, the well-known, known for the prison of slow death, and at that prison we were, as prisoners, assigned to label all the dead bodies in prison, because the death room, the isolation room we used to call it, where you collect all the dead bodies, it smelled so bad that the guard could not enter it. So they had to choose some prisoners to work on that, and for a period of time I was responsible for that, and day after day I had to live with all these dead bodies. I had to label them, but also what Maz just mentioned on behalf of the gravedigger, the fact that sometimes you are in a room that's supposed to only contain dead people, and sometimes you will have people alive and you can do nothing about it. You just leave them in this room until they die. They were taken from their rooms. Nobody would check if you actually still alive or not. If you look dead, they will take you to the dead room, and from there you have to die. There is no other option for you. Thousands of people died during my time in Branch 215, and they became, for the guard and even for the prisoners who were numbering them, they became just numbers. Because the number was so huge to be able to absorb the stories behind these people. At some point, you had to shut off your humanity to be able to survive. What you have to do is to accept that that's today's reality, and sort of to be able to move on and not be traumatized by the day-to-day photos or reality you're seeing in front of you. One thing I would add is it's super important to considering all the danger people like the Gravedigger or Caesar expose themselves to by telling their stories or bringing evidence out. The most important, most crucial thing we can do today is to create an environment that can make these people feel safe. So these witnesses, these people who smuggled the most important evidence we have against the Syrian regime for their crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity, the most important thing is to build an environment when Caesar can feel like he can come and testify in the US Senate or in the Security Council in the UN without worrying about his safety. That does not exist yet. He still every day worries about his safety. The same thing applies for the Gravedigger when he comes now to the US. He made it once, the second time. There is so much worry behind that, and it's incredible to believe that all the support and the protection for these very crucial witnesses has been actions taken by the Syrian Emergency Task Force, a very small organization operating in this big world, managed to protect the most crucial witnesses so far. But it's not enough to be a task force effort. It needs to be a joint effort by many countries, nations, where these witnesses are, to be able to maintain this, to keep this story, to keep it credible. But these people keep them protected so we can prosecute. We can have them come to court and testify against the ones who commit these atrocities against them and their beloved ones.
Thank you very much. I can't agree more that this needs to be a huge collective efforts, and thanks for the SETF for the great work they are doing. I'll be moving to our next guest speaker, Mr. Juma Al-Qasim. Juma works as an access and security manager with Bahar organization in the last 2 years and works closely with the displaced Syrians as well as victims and survivors of torture and detention. As mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Juma's father was killed during detention, and also 3 of his brothers were detained. Juma holds a master's degree. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Muhammad. I would start first congratulating all Muslims across the world with the Eid al-Fitr, and especially Syrians, which is like an occasion that is linked with happiness and cheerfulness. We in the Islamic world have to festivize the Eid and celebrate it this way. But for Syrian nation, it's a bit different. Every Syrian family have suffered a lot from this war over the last decade. So whenever such an occasion comes, there is a kind of mixed feelings, mixed passions in every household and in every family. Since every family in Syria has been impacted by the war through missing martyrs, by someone who passed away from shelling, another one who's still under torture, suffering Assad detentions, or drowned in the sea, running away out of the country, seeking asylum and refugees, and so on. My family is a normal, ordinary Syrian family that used to live in Idlib, north of the country before the Syrian revolution. And we have suffered a lot through the early years of the revolution from Assad regime detention. I have 3 brothers who were detained once and released later in different times, spaces through the 2011 till 2014 earlier years of the revolution. And then my father was martyred and passed away in 2015. Branch, the military intelligence services that Amar a while ago have mentioned the numbering issue in it. So during the 4 years, I have 3 brothers and 1 father. In the summer of 2011, the youngest, who's younger than me, was a university student, and he was marching in a protest there in Homs University in Al-Ba'th, and he was detained by a checkpoint there. So he stayed for less than a month, and he was later released. Just on the entrance of the dormitory of that university, a checkpoint captured him. It started like this. It was light, so he was under some torture and subjected to some interrogation, but yet the horribleness, let's say, and the amount of torture practiced over detainees was not that much bigger later in the years, when let's say the disture or the polarization between the loyalist Assadist and the pro-opposition parties were like diverging ways apart. So this kind of hatred speech and more violence that was neutralized by this hatred yet came more extreme, which impacted also mostly in the first stand detainees. 1 year later, my elder brother also, who's in his early 30s back in time, he was heading from our hometown in Marat al-Nu'man, north of Idlib, going to the city to pick up his salary. He was just a normal, ordinary public school teacher, and he has nothing to do with the overall movements. He was not like involved in activism, but it's just being what you are, or being from certain place in Syria. It's by own a standing accusation that could strip you your life under the slaughterhouses of Assad. So a checkpoint detained him. He was transferred to Idlib city center on the way of Saraqab, and then within a month, just like a month, he was released. And still, we are in the first 1 and 2nd year of the revolution. Things was light, as I described a while ago. And then the third brother was the eldest. He was in mid-30s when he was detained. He was just like a normal businessman. He was taking some furniture to one of his customers in Afrin area, and on the way Saraqab Idlib, he was stopped by a checkpoint. The security and army forces called my father on the cell phone to come and pick. My father was traveling with. So my father came, he took the car, my brother's wife and family. He stayed, they came back. 4 months later, we knew that he was in the Amn al-Askari in Idlib, the military intelligence service in Idlib city center. Later, he was transferred to Homs and then to Damascus, and he moved between roughly 3 different intelligence services. Then he was lately transferred to Adra civil prison, which was as portrayed by Syrian survivors as a heaven or a paradise in comparison to the intelligence services. He suffered there for 2 months from neurological problems, and then he was released just like after a full year of detention, moving between 3 different military intelligence services in Damascus capital. We bribed also some of the regime officers to ensure that he will be released just in the right time. He was having like real bad health conditions in his last days in the intelligence services before being transferred to the civil prison. Here at the time, like many Syrians who, like, I would not be fair if I say even like every single family in Syria have tested detention, but that's a standing fact. We need a long time to recover from this suffering, and thus is my eldest brother. The conclusion of our tragedy was with my father. Just before the release of my eldest brother, my father received a phone SMS called from a certain phone number that my brother directed to come and visit him in Adra. because it was the only chance after almost 10 months of communicating with his family. So my father and my brother's wife and my mom all traveled to Adra in Damascus, taking the risk to see my brother, who was found after like a long turmoil looking after him. So on their way back, just another checkpoint in Hessia area in Homs, stopped my father and detained him. They sent my mom and my wife, my brother's wife, hitchhiking with another car all the way back to our hometown. And they took also the car. So 60 days, and we're still trying to find a lead on my father's detention. Later, we got a news from one guy who was from a close by home town or community next to our hometown. And he said that your father is in Homs, standing in military intelligence services there, but he was transferred just like a few days ago to Damascus. And it was very sad that, you know, the earlier you can intervene, bribing some of the intelligence or trying through your network of connection in Syria, this is how like the regime is operating this way. So you could get him released, and in earlier stages, it's the better and easier it will be. The more further in time it goes, the more complicated it will be. So after that, 8 months later, without any word, in 2014, we received the news that one prison mate was released. And we got the news that my father passed away in the same military intelligence branch of 2015 in Damascus. Just a few days later, another prison mate also came out. We were at shock. You know, we didn't believe that maybe this guy is like, you know, a big portion of the released prisoners have some psychological and mental problems. So people even have this inclination not to live fully with what they have. But within the triangulation that we had, we could conclude that, yes, it's confirmed the news. Because another week later, another one prison mate also was released from a nearby hometown, saying that your father, who's 63 years old, diabetic, and having some problems in his legs, he was with his family and his wife. He was also, he died and passed away under torture. He was left in the corridor for 3 days by the prison keeper, and then they took his body. And this is another point that I wanted also to highlight within the leftover time in this seminar. We get this confirmation in the 14th of April 2014 is the approximate date of his death. Our family suffered a lot, especially my mom. She stayed like longer nights, not sleeping, waiting for her husband and son to be out. She cried tons of tears. She wept deeply about the loss. She also had a nephew that was martyred in early 2013. So all these conditions made it a continuous, so to speak, continuous melancholic, tragic atmosphere to live in within the first few years of the revolution. And here I left to Turkey, left the country and started to move between North Syria and South Turkey, working for different humanitarian agencies and journalists. My family took like longer time to recover from this past and still recovering. We tried a lot of getting information about my dad, my father's corpse, his own body, but there was no way to have it. We tried even with the bribes. The only thing that we were delivered from the testimonies of his prisoner mates who communicated his death to us. They said like the prison keeper, as I said, left his body for 3 days, and for sure, then they took it. For sure, it's taken. It's taken where to? Was it decently buried? Was it buried in a mass grave, alone standing in a decent cemetery yard or graveyard, or somewhere else, maybe thrown just like on the banks of the roads? Which cemetery, if it is so, etc. So this destiny revealance of the Syrian detainee is another crime that I would consider, and a lot would having the same. Just a piece of information I'm concluding here. According to the Syrian Network of Human Rights, there is more than 150,000 Syrians arrested from 2011 to 2021 in the past decade. And the Syrian regime have made 89% of the total arrest operations. So there is no need to prove that the Syrian regime is doing the whole atrocities across Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Juma. We're sorry for your loss, and we hope that your brothers are recovering well. Yeah. We'll be moving to Maryam. As mentioned earlier, Maryam Kamal Maz is the daughter of humanitarian psychotherapist Maryam Kamal Maz, a Syrian American trauma therapist who specializes in treating those affected by conflict and natural disasters around the world. He has been unjustly detained in Syria since February 2017, and Maryam, along with her family, have been advocates for the release of her father, raising awareness about those unjustly detained around the world as proponent of freedom and peace. In addition to her advocacy work, and now following her father's footsteps, she is co-founder of the soon-to-be nonprofit Be in Peace. Be in Peace continues the work of Maryam Kamal Maz, bringing a psychosocial trauma relief support for those affected by war and traumatic events around the world. She's also co-founder of Tomorrow's Dawn, Heart in Peace. Very welcome, Maryam. Can you please tell us about how the disappearance of your father impacted your life and the life of your entire family?
Of course. So my father used to help refugees. He had a center in Lebanon. It was called IIPD, International Institute for Psychosocial Development, and he treated refugees there for their traumatic events that they had gone through in the war. He hadn't been in Syria for a long time. We were all raised in America, and he was in the States since he was a really young boy. So it was very rare to go to Syria. However, I think he felt the need to head there first to visit family. He had some family members that were ill, and he wanted to check on them. And he was also told that a lot of people needed that psychiatric or psychological help, the same type that he was offering outside of Syria. Of course, he took his precautions before he went into Syria. He was sure to make sure that he was not wanted by the regime for any reason. You can be wanted for no reason at all. But he made sure, and he was clear, and he felt very comfortable heading in to check on the family and to see if anybody needed any sort of therapy. And he arrived on the 14th around 10 p.m. at night. The next morning, he slept the night at a family member's house. And the next morning, he was heading to his first trip to visit another family member when he was stopped at a checkpoint, and he disappeared there. And what we assume is that he had been basically handed over to the regime, even though they had not wanted him. His name was not wanted. However, he just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they decided to take him, even though when they searched him, they did find his American passport. And they still decided to take him at that time. So it's been a very, very difficult time for us, not knowing anything about him at all. Nothing. That was the last we heard from him, was the night before he disappeared. And we haven't heard from him since. Soon after, within these 5 years, so many of his family members have passed away, and we're left with nobody really in Syria to help us find him, besides trying to find connections of people that can help us, and that hasn't been very successful. We've had people that have scammed us, sent us fake pictures, asked for a ridiculous amount of money, and that has all taken a toll on us. Every time somebody promises us that they're going to be able to find him and get him out, and it sounds very promising, they get our hopes very high, and that doesn't last for long. It's unfortunate that then everything just comes slamming down. It turns out it's a lie, it's all fake, nothing is real. So it's been very, very, very stressful on our family. It's not knowing anything about him. that is making it way more difficult, not knowing if he's alive, if he's healthy, where is he exactly, how's his condition. I think that is what eats at us every night. You know, you go to sleep thinking, well, did I try this? Should I try contacting this person? Should I try contacting that person? Maybe this, you know, maybe I can try this. But nothing has been fruitful, and it's definitely taken a toll on us in the perspective that our lives have changed so much. This feels like it's my full-time job now, where I try to focus on my father and what I can do to get him out, and trying to find different routes, working with the United States government, with the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, with Congress and senators, but it's unfortunate that nothing has been fruitful. And my father is my grandmother's only son. She only has 2 other daughters, and you know, she's getting older, not any younger, and that's something that always concerns her. She always, when she talks to me, she always says, Maryam, do you think we'll ever see him again? Do you think, you know, will I survive to see him? Will I be able to see him again? And it's hard to tell her an answer, because I don't know. Maybe he's not alive. Maybe he is. We don't know anything. And that's what makes it really, the most difficult part is just the unknown, not knowing anything. So I would say it's been a very stressful roller coaster of highs and lows, not knowing anything, thinking we found out where he is, getting excited. Turns out it's not correct. And it's just consumed our lives completely. I've stopped socializing as much as we have. We've kind of closed the doors on ourselves and put this as our main focus, trying to find out more information about him, trying to locate him, trying to get him free, trying to understand how we can continue working with the US government. Is there any hope in the US government in getting him out with the situation that's going on in Syria and it being accepted slowly back into the world? So it's just a horrible experience, and I wouldn't wish it upon anybody to go through something like this.
Thank you very much for sharing your horrible experience. We're really sorry for what happened to your father and even to your family, and we hope that you can get some relief soon by knowing him, by having him released as soon as hopefully possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll conclude the first round of discussion with Ambassador Stephen Rapp. Ambassador Stephen Rapp has served as U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice from 2009 to 2015. In that role, he coordinated U.S. government support to international criminal tribunals, including International Criminal Court, as well as to hybrid and national courts responsible for prosecuting persons charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was credited with arranging for the United Nations Commission of Inquiry and other prosecutional authorities to gain access to the cache of 55,000 photos documenting torture by Assad regime. From 2007 to 2009, Ambassador Rapp served as prosecutor of Special Court for Sierra Leone. Also from 2001 to 2007, he served as senior trial attorney and chief of prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He received a BA from Harvard College and a Juris Doctor from Drake University Law School. Very welcome, Ambassador Rapp, and we're very lucky to have you. I'd like to reflecting on all these atrocities and examples of atrocities we have with us today, with Omar as survivor, Juma, and Maryam. What are the potential justice pathways to prosecute perpetrators of torture and atrocities related to mass graves and forced disappearance that were revealed by the gravedigger and our guests today? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, and it's a great honor to be the only non-Syrian on this panel and to hear again about these crimes and how it's affected these survivors, 3 of whom are on this, and survivors of direct torture, like Omar, and also then of the torture of forced disappearance, where the victim group is much larger than that of the individual who's experiencing the horrors in a prison like 215. They're going to bed every night not knowing whether the loved one is alive or dead, not knowing what horrors they may be suffering. And it's one of the reasons that I've been passionate about carrying forward the cases of the disappeared as direct victims of this crime. It's just another way in which this state, the Assad regime, terrorizes its own population. And it has been the area, thanks to this kind of testimony we've heard today and other work, really for which Syrians bear the greatest responsibility. They've brought out this evidence, Caesar and the gravedigger. I'm a chair of a group called CEJA, but we've benefited from having 40 Syrians on staff who've been working within the country and have brought out 1.3 million pages of regime documentation that tell the whole story of a regime that saw people in the street hoping and praying and chanting, for peaceful change, that their country could be a normal country, and that was an idea that the regime couldn't live with, and so it proceeded to arrest far more people even than were involved in those demonstrations in order to terrorize the population, against this hope and against certainly achieving a change in Syria, and we've seen all the horrors that follow. I know, having spent so much time with Syrians in the last 11 years, how frustrating and disappointing it is that where we had international courts for Rwanda or Sierra Leone or Yugoslavia, that we haven't had an international court for Syria, and that we've had to find justice kind of through the back door going into third countries. It is a contrast from what we now have in Ukraine, where Ukraine gave the ICC jurisdiction of the case by statements in 2014 and 2015. And of course, the government itself and its prosecutors are proceeding with cases charging 11 people that have been recently detained during the conflict with war crimes here just weeks after those crimes were committed. Of course, in Syria, Russia, in the case of Ukraine, we have aggression by a foreign country. In Syria, it's Assad committing aggression against his own people. So obviously, he's not going to send his case to the ICC. And the Security Council can't send it there because the Russians block even the most modest resolutions in regard to Syria. And of course, there won't be justice from the Assad regime for any of the crimes that it's committed until there's a transition. So as I said, we've gone to third countries that have benefited enormously from all of the materials and the evidence and the testimony, particularly the Caesar photos and the documentation, but then also the accounts of people like the gravedigger who testified in his trial in Koblenz, and the victims who themselves proceeded into court as victims, essentially as prosecutors, together with the German prosecutor, in proceeding with the case where a victory was won against two individuals, one junior, but one a colonel, the head of interrogation at Al-Khatib, General Intelligence Detention Center. And he was convicted, as you know, in January for 27 counts of murder and for implication and complicity in thousands of acts of torture. And of course, other cases are going forth in Germany under universal jurisdiction against persons they've been able to detain in Germany, including a doctor who was involved in torturing people in Homs in the early days of the conflict, when we saw the horrors of doctors themselves becoming agents of torture, as this regime began its business of committing unspeakable crimes in areas that had substantial opposition presence. And of course, we've got another case of one of these militia types, Shabia types, who indeed becomes part of the regime's forces, who kills people in the Palestinian refugee camp of Yarmouk, we're standing in a bread line. But other cases are going forward. One of the things that we hope is that there can be in the Ukraine situation, and I'm working with others trying to identify the possibilities of situations where Russians who are detained on the field who could be prosecuted potentially there, but who can be related particularly to crimes committed in Syria, might be transferred first to a country that's interested in pursuing those cases. That could involve, obviously the generals that were involved in leading these operations. And of course, the key general, a little hard to arrest him right now, who leads now the war in Ukraine, was of course the person that got that job because he led the suppression of the Syrian people for the Assad regime when Russia intervened in 2015. And though I know we're talking about detention, in detention we've had, when you're talking about these third country cases, generally third countries are only interested in people that are actually in those countries that they will do. Now, there are exceptions to that. The French have, and the Germans both have put out an arrest warrant against Jamil Hassan, the head of Air Force Intelligence, responsible for Jawiyah, or a horrific detention facility not far from the hospital where Caesar was taking photos, the same facility at Al-Mazab, and not far from Assad's own presidential palace. In that facility where our friend Mazen Hamada was tortured, and we hope he's not back because he was lured back into Syria. But certainly that individual is under an international arrest warrant, as is Ali Mamlouk, because of his superiority in the National Security Bureau over all of this. But those are cases in France that relate to the fact that there were 2 French victims in Jawiyah, the Dabas, Mazen and Patrick, who were tortured to death there. So to get cases into Europe, you often need either a European victim or you need to have the perpetrator turn up. But thanks to the evidence that's been so strong, because normally a country that's a third country can't cross borders, it can't build the case itself, it doesn't have the resources or even the right to go to Turkey and say interview people. It's relied on Syrians, and there are more and more of these cases that are coming, we hope soon in North America. Better alternatives are needed. I frankly advocate the creation of a joint court where several states would go together and form an international court, at least on chemical weapons, though I frankly like to see it on all these crimes, but where they would pool universal jurisdiction, and then they wouldn't have to respect head of state immunity, and they could have charged Assad himself because he's really the author of these crimes. But that's a step that the world hasn't taken yet, that they may be taking in the case of Ukraine, and that could create a precedent. So we shall see. But in the meantime, all my efforts are engaged in these in the struggle to put the evidence together, to make very strong dossiers, to identify senior suspects and send the signal that for those that commit these crimes, there will be no escaping it in this life. There'll always be the danger if you step out of line, if there's a transition in Syria, if you cross and visit friends in another country, or some of the assets that you've stolen, you could get caught, you could end up in jail, you could end up paying the price for being part of this regime. So those efforts continue, not enough, but at least some justice for the people of Syria.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive and informative answer. I'll be taking this forward to Muaz, who has worked with many witnesses of war crimes, and also to reflect on the Syrian Emergency Task Force's of efforts to bring these witnesses of war crimes to the USA and the international community for testimonies, accountability efforts, and political advocacy for the Syrian revolution. Can you share with us the great efforts that SETF is doing, Muaz, please?
Thank you, Mohammed. And I'm just, as I listen to everyone, answer your questions, it's very humbling to be on this panel. And it's also just a reminder to everyone of the pain that the Syrian people have felt, and that's also resulted in all of this destabilization, all these other horrific things happening elsewhere. I mean, as the gravedigger said, what's happening in Ukraine is so intricately tied to what's happening in Syria, the same playbook, the same horrific crimes. And for everyone listening, like as Maryam spoke, and Maryam is truly inspirational, for anyone, especially from the Syrian Syrians in the diaspora or inside the country, if you have heard anything about Maryam's father to please reach out directly, and we can share perhaps on the chat the email for Maryam and her family, that they're trying to find any information on their dad. As far as SETF is concerned, we have been an organization that started in Washington, sort of working specifically on advocacy all the way back in April of 2011. And although over time, our work increased in terms of doing some humanitarian work and some of the legal and war crimes documentation work, we simply wanted to sort of show people here really what's happening there. And without going to Syria, but like with all the explanations in the world, with all the, the reports that could be written or briefings and meetings, nothing is as powerful as hearing directly from these witnesses, these survivors, these amazing people that really are sort of inspirational on a global level for what they're able to do. I mean, ordinary individuals that have been put in these horrific circumstances and were able to do extraordinary things. And Mazen is one of them. I mean, Mazen is a horrific tragedy, but Mazen al-Hamada was our friend. Juma and I, and he went to different places, including, even in Malaysia, showing the Caesar photos and what's happening. Mazen was one of the people that SETF brought to the United States that met with so many members of Congress, both in the House and Senate, with the DOD, with the State Department, with the Holocaust Museum. And it was his advocacy and it was his work that really opened the eyes of many people to the atrocities in Syria, that even helped push legislation that helped save Syrian lives, deter torture, and so on. And then seeing how he was lured back by the Assad regime from Europe, right, from a place that's supposed to have protected him, that's supposed to be his asylum, is something that also should bring up a lot of questions for us. And Caesar, SETF has been, lucky to work with all these people, including Caesar, who, we helped facilitate over 6 trips to the United States to advocate and to show people what's happened in Syria. And also for him, I mean, this is someone that risked his life and his family's life to show the world, to bring out almost 55,000 photographs and even some documents of command responsibility and the camera and all this information. And he thought that, after sharing that information, that's it. He doesn't have to do more. But at the end of the day, he was even, he testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee in 2014. Later on in 2019, his photographs surrounded the members of Congress that were kind of, I think, looking on in stunned silence at these horrific crimes. But even that has not been enough, honestly, to move policy in the direction that is best both for the national interest, for example, my country, the United States, and for helping end the atrocities there. And the gravedigger, most recently, who has been someone that he just wants his voice to be heard, despite the risks to his life, despite the hardships that they went through, even after testifying in Koblenz. He's dedicated to share with the world what he has seen, which is mass graves that still go on today. And it's surreal to think about all of this out loud. It's surreal to say there are so many mass graves in Syria with hundreds of thousands of bodies and more being dug, and having the people that oversaw these things, people that were key and direct witnesses, tell the world what's happening, and then see the reaction that the world has given to Syria so far. And what's more heartbreaking is seeing how the inaction in Syria is resulting in the suffering now in Ukraine and who knows where else, as we allow this to unfold. So SETF's role has really just been to be a bridge for these voices. And one of the most powerful and inspirational voices that SETF is lucky to work with as part of its team is Omar Al-Shugri, who's here with us today, who has not spared a single minute through the years that I've known him, doing everything he can to advocate on behalf of the Syrian people and to actually make a difference. And I want to say, there have been hearings before the House and Senate. We're engaging with the State Department and the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. We are working with the media. We are doing everything we can to move U.S. policy in a better direction on Syria, because unfortunately, under consecutive administrations, so far we've failed the Syrian people, and in doing so, it's resulted in in things that not are only counter to our values, but counter to Western interests and the interests of democracies.
Thank you very much, Muaz, and thanks for the great effort that the CTF is doing in bringing and supporting these witnesses, documenting evidences, and also working as a security network for these brave survivors. I'll take also, I'd like to take this or start the next question with Omar. By reflecting on his, I think, healing and recovery journey as also key witness for war crimes. Omar, can you please tell us how did you feel when you shared your experience of detention and as a survivor and witness of torture in detention centers and mass human rights violations? And also, can you please tell us which platform or outlet that was the most empowering or remarkable for you while sharing your experience?
Firstly, let me add one thing to what my colleague Maaz said. One of the important things that the task force does is actually finding these people, finding people like the gravedigger who have these experience, but also these documents, finding different survivors who didn't know what to do with the fact that they have a heartbreaking story, but also a testimony they could use to add to the evidence against the Syrian regime. Going back to the question about healing, I think people has been key. When I left, when I came to the U.S. for the first time, I was met by Maaz. A very weird moment. He reached out to me on social media with a very weird profile photo of him, like Muhammad Ali. And I was sure it wasn't Muhammad Ali reaching out to me. It was Maaz. And then he said, you should come and meet some of my friends here in DC. And I did. And he started introducing me to politicians and start talking with, going to the Congress, have some meetings, talk about Syria. And so, and I was for the first time given the opportunity to tell this story, not only for the sake of telling a story, but for we have a clear objective why we're telling this story. We're trying not only to bring awareness, but to actually affect in what direction the actions are taken. So thanks to amazing people like Maaz, we managed to arrange hearings at the Senate, at the Congress. We met with people at the White House. We went to the UN Security Council. We spoke, and we will be speaking again. We are arranging something again on both the Security Council and the US Congress, because we think keeping our voice up is very important, because the world attention span is very short, but their memory is even shorter. So we need to keep the topic up all the time, reminding them of what's happening in Syria. And at this moment, because of the Ukraine war, of what happened in Syria is so relevant to what's happening in Ukraine today. And I think that the entire process of healing, to be able to heal, you need to learn the full truth, and you need to be able to understand, to have mercy for yourself and for others. We need to, as Syrians, to acknowledge that for so many years we suffered. We done some mistakes ourselves, but the other ones committed crimes against us, and we need to be able to have a vision for a better Syria, for a Syria where justice could take place and we can have democracy. I think what heals us today is the hope. It's the hope that we will have a better country. It's the hope that there are people like Caesar, people like the gravedigger, people like Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who is not Syrian and who could just go and choose to do something else now. And he decided to go with us a couple of months ago. Muhammad, he was with us in Turkey, meeting with in the rehab center, meeting with our kids, our women, the men who were injured in this war, deciding to take this responsibility, which it's not an easy responsibility to take. You're not just doing legal work. Ambassador Stephen Rapp is not just doing legal work. It's far beyond that. It's just involving your soul with these people, sympathizing with them every day, caring about them, worrying about them, asking about them, trying to improve their situation, and then use what they went through to prosecute their the ones who committed crimes against them. It's a much complicated process than just doing legal work. And I am very proud to have Ambassador Stephen Rapp supporting our cause and being on our team all the time. It's wonderful. So people like him, people like Maz and you bring so much hope and makes people like me who went through a lot believe that there is hope and that there are people who are capable of overturning this regime. There are people who are capable of running the country and having democracy in Syria and achieving justice. There are people who are good enough to guide us to a better, path for the future, and that's what helps healing at this point. But the final version of healing will come when the regime falls and when people learn all the truth they could learn, and then starting a country where actually you can have a place where you can go visit your father's grave. Juma, when I can go and see my father's grave, there is none. There's mass graves for these people. We to be able to heal, we need to be able to have a place where I can put some flowers on my father's grave. It's so important for our just mental health, for our acceptance of reality. We need to be able to honor the ones who sacrificed their lives so we could live today, sacrifice their lives so we could have a bigger chance to have freedom and democracy, to honor those ones who are today still suffering in these prisons because they one day went out to the street saying freedom, freedom, freedom.
Thank you very much. We're all grateful for the great efforts that you guys, Omaz, and especially Ambassador Rapp, doing for the cause of Syria and defending the victims and survivors and supporting them, of course. Juma, I'd like also to reflect on the connection between forced disappearance, detention, but also the safe return of IDPs to their original residential areas. Why do you think IDPs from your village or near Marat Noman or even Marat Noman have fears from going back to their homes, even though there are zero hostilities in these areas today?
Well, the case is pretty kind of generalized over all Syria. Like through the past decade, there was a series, so to speak, of intentionally deportation movements and forced displacements of certain areas that was either besieged or either hard to reach. So even before 2017, the Asitana Framework Agreement on the for de-escalate or de-conflicted zones or escalated zones in Dar'a, in Eastern Ghouta, North Homs, and parts of Idlib. Way before that, regime used to divide bits by bits or divide and conquer military tactic usage have been prevailing in the regime military battlefield and offensives that was led, which made this tremendous amount of displacement. Recent UN statistics of Northwest Syria says every 10 people in Northwest Syria, 6 out of 10 are from outside, from different IDPs, from different internally different areas, and the rest is from the hosting community, which is like a very, how to say, it's disturbing the demographical stability and the social kind of harmony within the Northwest. So now it's like a mixed kind of a second Gaza Strip within a small area in Northwest Syria. My hometown, Marat Noman, comes as like a second biggest gathering in Idlib province, and it's not so special like the rest of country, rural areas in other province in Syria. But what was special in January 2020 when the regime launched the last offensive and the Russians and Iranian militia against North Hama, South Idlib areas where the regime could move from Murik, Khan Sheikhoun all the way to Marat Noman, then from Eastern Idlib controlling the Abu Dhur, Sinjar all the way to Saraqib to the M5 highway. which is very well known humanitarian crisis for all the ones residing in Syria or in Turkey. More than 1 million, according to the UN OCHA statistics, have left their homes from Ma'arat Nu'man. Big part of these population were already displaced or IDPs people, and they were entirely wiped out from that date because of the offensive. Now, after, there was later on, like in a few months, there's a kind of Turkish-Russian political agreement for stabilizing and deconflicting the area, and now it's more or less a long-standing stability in Idlib, but of course it is depending on the Russian-Turkish harmony within this agreement. But what was special on Ma'arat Nu'man, it used to has IDPs from Homs, Hama, Ghouta, and other areas, Daraya, etc., hosted in that area. And now, after the battle, all hosting communities and IDPs have left together towards the north. So I portrayed, or I put it in this description, that we in Northwest Syria are having a kind of chronic displacement humanitarian crisis. There are people who has been for 10 times or less or more being on constant moving from area to area whenever the regime is controlling bit by bit, they're fleeing and running away. People have suffered a lot. They are living in a 40 by 60 kilometers square area in North Idlib, and it has more than 3.5 million. And this is, again, like a UN statistics provided to you, and almost 1 million in the rest parts of North Aleppo, in Afrin, Azaz, and Al-Bab areas. So you can see how much it is a very crowded area that has almost a quarter of Syria. And there is a really big pressure and shortage on shelter facilities. So people, why not to return? If you would favor yourself sitting all the days, all the years that have passed under a tent that is not protecting you from the heat of the summer or the rain in the winter, or that does not provide you any privacy, why to favor this very deteriorated life conditions than returning back to Assad regime controlled area? The question that have been asked through researches that I've done and many other academicians have done in this literature, the answer was simply because it's a life threat. Returning or considering returning to regime controlled areas, unless there is a political solution and guarantees in place, would never be considered by Syrians. 2.5 years since this last displacement in my hometown, and less than 3% of the people have returned. Can imagine how the real desire for the people to return is in these current conditions. The Brigade 25, which is controlled by a famous butcher from the Syrian army, the Colonel Suhail Hassan, is also setting a small training military zone in our hometown in Ma'arat Nu'man. We have seen some photos leaked that reached our hometown people. And this is a very important pushing factor for Syrians to even leave the country, not to stay. Similarly, you can compare it with the Assad controlled area. Now, why there is still big amount of people on constant move outside of Syria because they're running away of the conscription outside the country. Even now it's stable and we are living the post-war, so to speak, era, but there was not a real standing solution for a permanent future for Syrians to return to their country. And again, in these academic literature I've reviewed, the possibilities of Syrians, if you ask most Syrians outside and even inside, would you consider returning to your own hometown? Do you wish that? The majority of them wish it till now. Over 80% wish this, but the real linkage or juxtaposition between this return and the precondition for it is the political solution, the security sector reformation, the reformation, the improvement of this, the watering down of the current security apparatus, which is like just a police state that is leading the country. So we have seen, like all Syrians, the recent footage of Al-Tadamun massacre that was videotaped by butchers very proudly and ruthlessly and mercilessly, killing around 50 people in eastern and southern Damascus suburbs. And this is in the capital, as Ambassador Rapp says, it's just like a few meters away from the presidential balance, and all these atrocities are taking place. This is not giving any justification for the top of Assad regime, the president person to run away with these atrocities. So it has shown how Syrians are always worried about their futuristic notion of the return. Me and many others have been uprooted from their hometowns. We all have nostalgia, we have memories, we have this kind of social close family ties that was broken. All of us, we are, how to say, like we miss these in the past, but maybe this generation, it's not the coming one, or maybe the later one, or maybe not, there is still a hope of returning. And that's what Umar, he said, like it's the gas that we are living now on, so to speak. One of the casualties in this Tadamun massacre was a famous name, Wasim Siam, whose father and mother just knew that their son's destiny was horribly being terminated and killed by a monster through the leakage of the video that was 9 years ago happening. And they were on 9 years waiting. And this is me and Maryam here speaking, maybe in the same position. 9 years waiting, staying at night, being sleepless, always worried, always disgruntled by the fact that I cannot do nothing. I feel helpless. And that same monster, like keeping a precious and dear person to me, is not giving a glimpse about his destiny. This is like another big violation, aside from the same action, from the same atrocities itself. It's not like to give me or unveil for me the destiny of these detainees. So this forced appearance and intended hiding of Syrians' destiny, I see it also, as I said, a big crime, and by its own, it's according to the international standards of prisoners in management or human rights charters or UN commissions of human rights, etc. There should be more steps by the international community, organizations, State Department, and other also MOFAs of the country supporting Syria to have now a step forward for this. It's a timing that I think we should move as a whole, as Omar said on this. The personal safety is definite possibility for like being detained by any checkpoint. That is the Mohammed summarizing the answer again, is what is obstructing IDPs from returning towards regime area while living for long years in a dire situation under tent. That is the return option.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. We'll move to Maryam to also ask her to share her family's struggle in calling for her father's release and reveal of information about his fate, just to share the experience and the daily struggle that they are facing. Over to you, Maryam, please.
Thank you. Of course, it's been 5 years, and it's been we've gone through a lot within these 5 years, but within the first 2 years, we decided to stay very private about my father's case in fear of the Syrian regime retaliating and harming him more. So we decided to stay very quiet and try to work with connections inside of Syria, hoping that we'll, learn something about him, hear something about him without taking it public. Although after 2 years, there was a famous story that was that had just happened. I think it was Leila Shweikani, where her family was not actually public, but her story had become public, and news was circulating that she had probably been executed and passed. And at that point, I think we realized that, does it really matter if you're private or if you're public? At the same time, your fate is destined. And, if those that are private, so many have not made it. And those that are public, there are very few Syrian American families that are public. I think we're majority. Actually, I haven't met any. I wish I would. But the only other case is Austin Tice's case that's public. And it was a very difficult decision for us to make. It was either staying private and possibly facing the same destiny as all the other detainees, or deciding to go public and try a different route and see if anything different could come out of this. It took a lot to convince the family and to feel that it's a safe move for my father, for us to speak out about his story, ask for help publicly. But luckily we had Syrian Emergency Task Force on our side, and they helped us take our story public. We reached out to a lot of news channels and decided to reach out straight to President Trump at that time, hoping that maybe he would be able to step in and try to help us get our father home. President Trump at that time had made it a personal mission to try to free as many American detainees around the world, and he had been successful with a lot of cases. During that time, we started heading to DC, meeting with senators, congressmen, officials, White House officials. Eventually, President Trump sent 2 White House officials to Syria. One of them was SPIHA, Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Creston, and a White House official, Kash Patel. He sent both of them to Syria, and it was the first time, I think, in 10 years that any White House officials had gone into Syria. And they sat down with, I believe it was Ali Mamlouk at that time, and they requested information about these detainees, and they were told nothing at all. They not even, acknowledging that they have these detainees, nothing. So they walked out of there with no new information. We still don't know anything at all. So we're still struggling. I think it's been trying to find different routes, and it's been a very difficult journey to try to find out any sort of information about him. But even having the United States government head to Syria, request information, has failed. As well as, it's a basic human right to be able to know about a person that's detained. The Syrian government hasn't said any crime against him, no charges against him. There's no sentence against him. There's nothing at all. They're just holding him purely for, the same reason that they're holding all the other detainees in Syria, just taking people in just for no reason, really. And so until this day, we decided to go public, hoping that maybe my father's case can help other cases as well, and we can help raise awareness about how unjust the situation is in Syria. All the other American detainees in Russia, Venezuela, China, they all get to speak to their family members. They all get to have phone calls with them and have diplomats visit them in the detention centers. Except for us, nothing at all. It's not knowing anything is what makes it the most horrific thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We really understand that this is a very personal matter that you are sharing with us, and we all stand with you and wish that you get some relief very soon. Ambassador Rapp, I'd like to refer to the recent video shared by the Guardian newspaper about a brutal massacre at Tadamun neighborhood in Damascus that was shared recently. Can you please talk about organizations such as Commission for International Justice and Accountability, CIJA, whose mission is to collect and preserve evidences which can become key future prosecutions such as in Koblenz trial.
Well, it's impossible, I think, for those of us who know so much of what's going on in Syria from Syrians in the last 11 years to be shocked, but it was particularly shocking to see this video. Obviously, we know of cold-blooded killings like those of Omar's family, but to actually have the killers filming it and for them to be in the end boasting and justifying it, just in terms of what we think a human being should be about, it is shocking, and to realize that obviously the person who now has confessed to this, and thanks to the brave and just amazing efforts of this young woman who continued to engage and try to draw him out, to have this kind of information publicly, I think really shows what this regime is about, because this individual was not just a Shabia thug. An irregular militia type that had been recruited among sort of gangster elements to go commit these crimes. He's actually an officer in 227, one of the military intelligence facilities out of which the Caesar photos came. So he was sort of doing this in I shouldn't say his spare time, but to some extent, it seems that his attitude was, well, in prison we kill him slowly, but I'd rather kill him fast, and kill him in this just such heartless way. It's the kind of crime that just demands justice and action on our part. Now, of course, when we deal with the detention facilities, the crimes documented by Caesar, who brought out 55,000 photos, 27,000 of them were these numbered corpses, about 4 photos for each corpse, with the numbers written on the bodies and also on a white card. Omar having been involved in 215, which is the place where the majority actually of the Caesar corpses come from, because it's such a large facility and because people did die there of the torture and starvation. But this evidence shows a system, and that's what the German case did. It was quite significant. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this was a part of a pattern of what this government was doing, of arresting, of disappearing people, putting them in these prisons, sometimes going through a process after they've been truly traumatized and weakened and almost killed, of releasing them to sort of send a message to others not to even dream of opposing the regime, but then quite often being killed by the mistreatment, by the torture, or in some cases, because they've been coerced into making a confession, executed at places like Sitnaya, where Omar would have been executed, but for his mother's intervention. And so, those are a pattern of crimes. And so we have a lot of people that were involved in that detention and in those facilities, and a fair number of them that moved out of the country into refugee flows and are in Europe and elsewhere pretending to be victims when they're in fact victimizers. And that gives us an ability, when we find somebody and we can identify them and put them in that structure, to have a good criminal case. These cases of more one-on-one killing outside of prisons require more effort. I mean, obviously we have at CIJA, as I say, more than a million pages of regime documents, and you can see the documents about how things were organized and how the Shabia is deployed, et cetera, how eventually the Shabia is actually brought up many times into the security services. And so that helps you put the pattern evidence together, but you also need, eyewitnesses. You need people who are willing to come forward and obviously with a peril to their families, describe, talk about what happened that they've heard or know, or, if you have survivors of particular massacres, this has often been essential in these prosecutions. Now, as I say, one of the cases in Germany right now that involves this killing in the Palestinian camp in Damascus actually is one of these more direct kind of one-on-one killings. But it's a matter of putting the evidence together. But in the killings, you need more of the sort of human testimony where in the prisons, we've got the Caesar photos, at least through August of 2013. And we have this whole numbering system of the regime itself for sort of bureaucratic reasons, taking pictures. And those photos having been brought out by Caesar because of his enormous courage. I think Joma's comment, I think, is extremely important, and people have to understand this, Danish officials or other people in Europe, and when folks discuss refugees and why half of the people in Syria are displaced, it's because of these crimes. This was not a war fought between the government and the Free Syrian Army, or the government, or various other opposition groups, with them shooting back and forth at each other. It was a war fought by the regime against civilians, and it was and the way people are targeted, picked up on the street. Even how these 41 or more victims that are shown in this video. I mean, these weren't people who were political activists. It seemed like it was enough to be an adult Sunni and not to be a regime officer, and you'd get and you'd be eligible for being picked up and killed in this mixed neighborhood of Al-Tartamam in Damascus. And so that kind of horror, the kind of thing that we've seen so many times I remember the case we brought in Spain, the guy who was delivering groceries wholesale to those shops, et cetera, that he would be driving through areas that had been opposition. And so because he was driving through areas that had some opposition forces, he gets picked up and he gets tortured to death, and his sister sees his photo. And so, this is the kind of horrors that are being committed by this regime that have made life intolerable. And it's why there really can't be any compromise with this regime, and there can't be any normalization. But I think we'll get into that at the end of this discussion about where we go here. But in the meantime, we build the evidence on the cases, identify as many of these suspects as we can. But it does require, people to identify these suspects, and many times to provide the personal witness that's necessary to put together the final link between this individual whom you may be able to bring to court and a horrific crime.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rapp. I'll take Omar's comment that people's memory and maybe politicians' memory is quite short. So, Muaz, I would like to ask you, what are SETF plans for keeping the issue of torture, war crimes, mass graves in Syria on headlines, and as driver to pursue justice for victims and survivors?
Well, with Omar's comment, which is very true, we want to, as much as possible, remind people every single chance that we get of what's happening. And that begins, though, with ensuring that there is a safety net for these key witnesses, for these survivors and their families that are tied to these different prosecutions or witnesses to these horrific massacres. And this remains something that has been, I think, missing in the overall international sort of justice and accountability efforts, is that for a lot of these people, they're often left alone. And through the Key Witness Fund of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, that's one thing we try to do to make sure, number one, they have that safety net. And then the step beyond that is to use this overwhelming, heart-wrenching content, right, that's coming out of Syria daily, and that's been coming out since 2011, including the Caesar photos, in the satellite images of the mass graves. And so the Caesar exhibit, which we have taken, all around in the past, is now sort of a Caesar exhibit / mass graves exhibit that we plan to take to different universities and parliaments and museums, and really, every place possible to remind and show people what's happening. We're also constantly working, through our good friends, for example, in the US Congress and other institutions, to ensure that policymakers and the media and the public are constantly hearing what's happening. And so we're working on organizing and suggesting witnesses for hearings and briefings, both in the US House of Representatives and the United States Senate and the United Nations, in terms of public and private events. The past ARIA Formula event was so powerful, featuring Omar, Rawad, and Ibrahim, and we're looking to do more of that, especially to push back on some of these, mind-boggling normalization trends that we see with certain countries. And we're also, at the end of the day, the fight for justice, accountability, the fight for shining light on what's happening in Syria is not just about Syria. And Ambassador Rapp, often reminds us that when you let somebody like Assad be able to get away with everything, do all of these things, that this sends a message to other dictators and authoritarians elsewhere. And it's not limited to that. And we've seen that in practice, right? And we've seen what little care the world had. I find it hard to see like how many condemnation, like just how little people cared about what happened in Syria, especially in terms of the Russian involvement. Now we see them using that same playbook in Ukraine. And one thing that I'm very proud of is being a part of this new network that started at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, called the Syria-Ukraine Network, which Bahar, other Syrian American Medical Society, other Syrian and Ukrainian organizations are in. And what's powerful about it, it's a reminder that these evil forces are the same, and that these people that are aspiring to have the same rights and liberties that we have in the United States, that they are in the West, in Europe, pursuing that, we're all in the same fight. And so the war crimes documentation and accountability and advocacy aspects of what's happening in Ukraine and Syria, what's really inspirational is that these people that are facing these overwhelming odds have been the greatest help to each other. That Syrians, as helpless as they may seem, have been the best experts as how do you, take care of, how do you provide medical care under bombardment, but also how do you archive, how do you document, how do you try to pursue justice, even when some justice avenues are closed. And finally, I'll wrap up, is that we will continue to do all we can to pursue civil and criminal investigations in the United States. In Europe, we will work with any organization, any law firm, media, policymakers, law enforcement officials to ensure that anytime that there's a chance to pursue any semblance of justice, that we do that. And what's really important, and I think I speak on behalf of millions of Syrians when I say that we'll never forget a single crime that has been committed. We'll never forget a single massacre, a single barrel bomb or chemical weapon or torture victim or forcibly disappeared person. All these crimes will never be forgotten. And regime officials, Russian officials, Iranians, Wagner militia, Hezbollah, all of these horrific criminals that have done these things to the Syrian people should know that they will never, and they should never just rest easy. And for those that even sort of consider normalizing with these war criminals, we'll make sure that the media pressure and congressional pressure and hopefully other governments across Europe and the US's pressure will shame them. We'll do no, and make sure that this doesn't happen, and push back against it. And so as dark as all of this is, I'm very hopeful because I work with an amazing team and there are so many amazing organizations, individuals, and most importantly, the Syrian people have just truly been inspiring. And as long as one single kid in Syria on the border, remains in an IDP camp or so, as long as the millions of Syrians remain in this fight, the very least that we can do is help be a platform for them in the pursuit of that justice. And I think identifying war criminals, identifying victims, and pursuing every possible case of justice and accountability is something that will be ongoing. But at the same time, the priority has to be and always will be to end the killing in Syria, to stop these atrocities as we try to pursue justice for all of those that have already gone on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to remind attendees that they can share their questions on the chat by indicating the guest that they would like to get an answer from. I'd like to ask our guests to be brief for the next round of questions, pending attendees' questions. Omar, briefly, can you please just share a message to your guards, perpetrators of war crimes? For example, the brutal officer committing Tadaman massacre. Can you just share a message with those horrible people? I know that you were in touch also with one of the guards that could reach you and ask you to shut up. Just a message for this small one for these criminals.
Well, first, let me tell a message to the ones who are the good guys, people like me, people like you, who are trying to do something good. My message for them first is that it sometimes seems very challenging and very traumatizing, and we realize there is so little attention from the world to change what's going on in Syria. We realize there is discrimination of how the world view us and how they view other countries, and there's so much. We went through so many disappointments over the last 11 years. However, there has been more than 500,000 people who died, and 1 million people at least who've been tortured, who went through what they went through and sacrificed their life for us to keep fighting for freedom. What we went out for in Syria is for freedom and democracy. We didn't go out just to go to a protest and go back home, or to ask for freedom and go back home without achieving it. And especially now, after losing so many souls asking for freedom, we should never return back home before we achieve freedom. And it's as the famous quote says, that it always seems impossible until it's done. It's gonna be a long walk. It's gonna be challenging, and you would need to be able to do something to help the Syrian revolution. Something you love doing, something you can enjoy for so long time so you don't get tired of doing it, right? You need to find a thing that's joyful for you to do, to contribute to this revolution. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sustainable. And our fight is not a 1 year fight or 2 years fight. We will take years. Even after the regime falls, we need some time to be able to align our lines and actually to build democracy. And for the ones who've been committing crimes, whether that's murder or torture or all kind of crimes that been allowed in Syria, sometimes when you have the power, it feels like you'll always have it. But there are many examples that Ambassador Stephen Rapp can tell you about where you actually don't keep the power for so long, 10, 20 years, 30 years, but afterwards, things gonna change. The regime will change, and when the regime will change, you will be held accountable for your crimes. So in 2013, when I was in branch 215, the guards were afraid from no-fly zone, because the world was at that time talking about no-fly zone for Syria. So the guards would come to the prisoners and ask them, hey, do you want to write a letter to your parents, to your family, and ask them for money? They give me money. I give half of it to you, half of it to me, and then I can give you cigarettes with the money. You can buy cigarettes from me, or you can buy salt, or I can give you extra potato. And these guards changed a little bit because they needed to survive themselves. They said, okay, at any time I may lose my position of power, so I need to gather as much money as I can and run away. So the guards, I understand that they're trying to have every human is trying to have a better future, sort of, but the way of abusing the power the way they are doing is not any way for a better future. It's not a way to protect yourself. And you're as someone who's working with the regime, your first threat is not the opposition. Your first threat is the regime itself, that knows how much you have seen and how much you have done, that you can be a witness, a testimony against the regime itself, like the ones that have been arrested and prosecuted in Germany. The first thing they would say this regime, they would try to put it on the regime itself. And we saw in Syria, the president of Saidnaya prison was not killed by opposition. He was killed by the regime itself, because they have been there for so long time. They know the whole story and they have all the orders, all the papers. So I better kill them and bring a new one so nobody can hold me accountable, because the main person is gone. The ones who actually can point at the president himself and say, hey, I get orders from the president himself. So for you who are working with the regime, your first threat is the regime, because you're just a tool. You are being used on a daily basis, and if you try to refuse, you will be killed. And if they know that you will run away, you will be killed. So you have to consider taking a different path, where you can secure, save your life at least, and go to somewhere else, where you may be prosecuted for your crimes, but you wouldn't be just killed from the ones who you've been supporting for so many years. Because at some point, justice needs to be achieved to bring peace and stability to Syria, regardless of how many people get prosecuted. So again, the people who are supporting the regime, this regime will never be normalized. There are millions of Syrians who suffered on the hands of this regime. They will always talk about it. There are not only one Omar, there is not only one Caesar or one gravedigger. There are thousands of people, of these people. There are millions who will be talking about it for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 60 years, until they die, and then their children and grandchildren will tell the same stories to make sure this regime will fall and we achieve justice in Syria. That's why you can't keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to go back to Maryam and ask you, Maryam, what keeps you going and fighting for your dad even after 5 years of not knowing and unrest?
I'd say first of all is not knowing anything. I think makes us want to know his fate, what has happened to him. That's number one thing that keeps us going, as well as the injustice of the situation in Syria. I think it's difficult for us to stay quiet when there's so much injustice happening, not only in my father's case, but in all the other thousands of cases of people that have been arbitrarily detained, unjustly detained in Syria. Somebody needs to speak out, and somebody needs to keep working for their cause. And so I do feel like it's a duty to keep working on my father's case and continue to raise awareness about the situation that's happening in Syria. And we still need to know something about him. Anything, any news is better than no news at all. Just to know how's his health, where is he exactly located? We've heard so many different rumors, so many different places that we've lost track. It's hard to tell. And and also as well as our faith in God, we stay that our faith that God will help bring him home and bring all those that are unjustly detained home, and that he will help us find our solution to this problem. But it's also another thing is just not knowing anything. It's the constant tug and fight of I need to know something, and that keeps the drive going to continue to fight to find out more information. So it's I can't say it's an easy journey. It's been very difficult, but there's no way we can stop. No way. It's not possible.
Sure. Wishing you all the best of luck in your pursuit of justice and truth as well. Going back to Juma, and I'll be closing with Rapp. Still, we don't have any questions from our respected audience. Juma, given your family's experience and loss, what do you think can be a reparation for you and other families of Syrians who died in detention? Briefly, please.
Well, similar to my colleagues who just mentioned a while ago about the management of the whole detention and violations with this sadistic regime, I would say, like Shakespeare once said, let Rome melt in Tiber. I would say, let Assad melt in Barada River. Just having the same metaphor that the Bashar al-Assad person himself should be brought to court and see this, even the same person who killed my father, who raised me, who was like very dear, precious person to me, in a face-to-face time. I'll not ensure myself what to do, but I'll tell you that I'll not be that much retaliating person, because it's a case of whole nation. So retaliation is not the solution. No, it's all linked to Bashar al-Assad person himself. He's the one that ordered all of that. He's the one who orchestrated and engineered all of this killing, and he was the one to be responsible since the first spark in Daraa. Once Zaman al-Wasl, a well-known journal, Syrian journal, leaked that there is around 78,000 official security personnel in Syria in early 2011 to 2013. And there are much more of them who are unofficial, like the National Defense, another militia that was annexed to the security apparatus of Syria. So these need all to be detected if a soon future Assad leave the authority, or kind of political solution happens. Because the utter justice, I don't think it's achievable here on this earth, but at least the top of these security personnel, the main joint leaders, and these leaders should be kept detected and justice to be. Our dream in future Syria is to demolish this police state recognition by all Syrians and move towards democracy. So that's what I would say as a version.
Thank you very much. I'll close out with Ambassador Rapp. So no peace without justice, but in a complex conflict like Syria, how can a realistic approach for justice be achieved in a way that can bring about relief to survivors and families of victims, but also takes into account the limitations of existing justice mechanisms and the need to move on? Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, I believe and I know that we can't have peace without justice. And, obviously in the peace negotiations that have taken place in Geneva, justice isn't even on the table. Release of detainees is inadmissible. Establishment of even a truth commission to tell people where the bodies are buried. Sort of essentials of conflict resolution in every other situation is completely rejected by the regime that's talks only about accepting certain constitutional changes that are frankly only cosmetic. So that's not peace. And we're frankly not going to get peace from the Assad regime. We're not going to get peace at the conference table. It involves, I think, and the world really requires an entirely tough approach here. I mean, we've seen the price that we paid for impunity when it comes to Assad. We had begun, to make some progress in 20 years or so after the Cold War with justice, with President Milosevic being brought to justice for the crimes. The vast majority of his victims were Muslims in Kosovo and in Bosnia, including in Srebrenica. Later, of course, he didn't survive his trial, but he was tried for 4 years and died just before the case would have ended. But Mladic and Karadzic were brought to justice. In Rwanda, we brought the prime minister to justice. In Sierra Leone, we brought the president of the neighboring country that had been responsible for the group that had committed massive sexual violence and amputation and murder. Brought him to trial and through to conviction, and today he's doing 50-year sentences. So we began to create the perception that if you committed these crimes, you could face consequences. But since Assad has been allowed to get away with it, basically because he's not in any of these institutions, and he's protected by Russia in the Security Council, and then Russia on the battlefield, in the third or fourth year of the conflict. The message has been you can get away with these crimes, and so we've had the genocide of the Rohingya by the Myanmar government, and then when it's even faced with internal questioning, it commits a coup d'état and throws out Aung San Suu Kyi that had supported them on the crimes against the Rohingya. You have what China is doing with the Uyghur and Kazakh and other Muslim minorities in China. And in Xinjiang, you have the crimes, the Sudan regime, where they had overthrown Bashir, and there was some prospect of him being brought to justice in The Hague, and now they've run a coup d'etat. And then, of course, we've got the horrors being committed in Ukraine. We have international law. There are rules that apply to conflict. There's rules that apply within your own country, what you can do with your own people. You can't conduct torture at all, ever. No excuse. You can't engage in any kind of widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, or a system of mass disappearances and arrests. Those violate the code of humankind. And if we allow people to get away with these crimes, none of us are safe anywhere in the world, full stop. So, I mean, the answer here is that we have to continue the political pressures. At the moment, I think because of Ukraine and because people see the connection, the prospect of any progress on normalization for Assad, I think, is considerably diminished. But we can't count on that subsisting forever. If there's some kind of a peace agreement or stalemate in Ukraine, there may be pressure again to move back the path of normalization. And that requires constant political motivation of the kind that SETF leads in the United States with the Caesar Act, and with pressure on administrations of both parties to implement the full range of sanctions that are available under those statutes, or even to pass a Caesar Act number 2 that mandates the sanctions against certain entities. And then there's the law. And I think the most important thing that we've had in one of the most important things, because I think the most important thing that we had in the German cases is victims being able to stand up in court and testify and tell the truth and confront one of the individuals, major individual in that prison that was responsible for their suffering, and have the law declare that they were innocent victims, and that he was the perpetrator, and that righting of the wrong, or somebody with all the power can dehumanize and crush another human being and disappear them and commit unspeakable acts, that the way in which the law can bring balance back to that, and an appropriate balance based upon the truth in which the perpetrator is appropriately punished, I think is an extremely important thing when it's done at all, anywhere, anytime. An extremely important thing, because it never happens in Syria, and that's one of the fundamental problems in Syria under Assad and his father. There is no rule of law. There's only the rule of power on the part of a regime that maintains all the power and wealth to itself, and that would threaten and destroy anyone that would threaten it. So that's an important aspect of the case. But I wanted to mention the sort of precedential value of it, because it's not just the conviction of Anwar Raslan. In order for it to be a crime against humanity, and the Germans needed an international crime in order to have jurisdiction over that case, that had to be part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population that was part of government plan or policy. And so they established that. And so it was a conviction of the entire regime in a sense. And so now anyone that aids that regime, any banker that makes a loan that allows someone to make an investment, to build some development on property that's been stolen from people that have been disappeared, tortured, and murdered, is complicit in those crimes. They're accessories to those crimes. Now, if they're sanctioned, there's things you can do. And we've had cases like a Paris bank that paid $8.9 billion for being complicit in breaking sanctions on Bashir in Sudan, and sanctions also against Iran. But others could face that same consequences if they're sanctioned, but also just because they'd be complicit in those war crimes, and those corporations could be sued, and massive amounts of recoveries achieved. So it's important to use those tools and to really send a signal that there can't be normalization. There can't be re-entry into the world economy and the monetary system and anything else until there is a transition that's agreed to, and that provides at the bare minimum for unwinding some of this with the truth and with the release of the detainees, and toward patterns in the future that could establish systems of justice in the country. I don't want to exaggerate the possibilities of negotiating anything, but it'll take intense pressure, and frankly, in other situations, that kind of intense pressure is hastened today when people within that country, including those within the power structure, realize that their leadership is an enormous liability to their futures. And that, in the case of other leaders, a Milosevic or a Taylor or other situations, have led for them to be elbowed aside, sometimes by people that are a bit unsavory, but people that will have to change things and open things up if they're going to achieve any progress and retain power. So I think our strategy needs to be with the strategy that it's been, and it needs to be intensified. That we need to bring forth the evidence, use that evidence in the political process, but more importantly, use it in court proceedings, expand the jurisdiction and the capacity of institutions to go after these crimes, and continue the fight for justice, because there cannot be peace. There certainly can't be returns until some measure of justice is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, indeed, there need to be increasing efforts, and also more people like yourself, like the SETF team, and all Syrian human rights advocates and activists who continue to push this matter forward and keep calling for justice and lobbying internationally, and bring the global awareness to the Syria cause, and of course call for justice. I think we come to an end with our event today. I'd like to thank all the guest speakers who spared the time to be with us today, and also I'd like to thank all the attendees who I hope you have enjoyed this discussion with all these experts and all the survivors and family members of victims, that we hope they come to relief and very soon. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.